You are listening to Sophie and Sebastian. In this episode, the mailman makes a special delivery. The mailman. Every morning, the mailman walked down the street, delivering letters and parcels. Sebastian liked his blue uniform, his cap and his mailbag. It was hard to talk to him because he was so fast. But there was the delightful sound of the mailbox clanking shut, and Sophie liked the feeling that you could depend on the mailman. The mailman came every day, in the snow and the rain, when the sun was smiling and when the wind whisked the leaves down the street. Even with icicles hanging from his beard, the mailman would wave and smile. One day, Sophie decided that they should play mailman. She said to Sebastian, "You can be the mailman, and I will tell you what to do." "Okay," said Sebastian. Sophie gave Sebastian a cap and a bag. She even pinned some ribbons to his shirt. "These are from the Queen," she said, "for extinguished service to the King." Then Sophie dropped a single envelope in Sebastian's mailbag. "This one is for Mrs. Wilson." Sebastian took out the envelope and looked at it. It was full of stickers. "Don't just stand there," said Sophie. "You have to bring it to Mrs. Wilson." Sebastian put the envelope back in the bag. Then Sophie grabbed his hand and brought him to Mrs. Wilson's house. "Now put the letter in the mailbox," said Sophie. "I can't. It's too high." "Oh, for Pete's sake, just stand on the flower pot." Sebastian climbed on top of the flower pot filled with petunias. Then Sophie opened the mailbox and Sebastian put in the envelope. "Now we have to wait," said Sophie. "Why?" "Because Mrs. Wilson has to read the letter and send a response. That's called a respondence." "Why?" "Because you can't just send one letter. You have to send them back and forth." "Why?" "Stop saying why. You have to send letters so that the mailman has something to do." "Why?" said Sebastian. He had a grin on his face. "Just because," said Sophie. And that was that. They sat on Mrs. Wilson's porch and they waited. Sophie petted Mrs. Wilson's cat, Darcy. Then they waited some more. "This is taking forever," said Sebastian. "Not forever," said Sophie. "Just a really long time." Then she added, "But I can sing you a song if you like." "Okay," said Sebastian. So Sophie sang a song. "Sing a song of waiting and rest your weary head. The mail is in the mailbox and everyone's in bed. When the door is open, the letters will be read, and then the people all will cry because we will be dead." Sophie stopped. Then she explained that when you're bored, it's kind of like dying. Then you say, "I'm bored to death." Sebastian frowned. "Don't worry," said Sophie. "It's only a thing you say. But let's not wait any more. We'll ring Mrs. Wilson's doorbell, and then we'll run and hide. Actually, you ring the doorbell because you're super fast." So Sebastian plucked up his courage, stood on his tippy toes, and rang the doorbell. Then he ran and hid with Sophie behind the bushes in the garden. It was a brave thing to do, and Sebastian felt a sort of fluttery feeling in his tummy. Mrs. Wilson opened the door. She looked surprised. No one was there. Sophie started to giggle, and she had to cover her mouth with her hands. Then Mrs. Wilson looked down and saw the crumpled petunias in her flower pot. She frowned and looked around. "Duck," whispered Sophie to Sebastian. Mrs. Wilson looked around some more. She said to Darcy, "I must be getting old. I thought I heard ducks in the garden." Then she checked her mailbox. Lo and behold, there was a letter, even though it was way too early for the mailman. "Well, isn't this lovely?" said Mrs. Wilson. "It's a special delivery. I'm going to get my cup of coffee and read this letter on the porch." She disappeared inside. "Quick," said Sophie. "Take off your clothes." "What?" said Sebastian. "Your mailman clothes." "Oh." Sebastian ditched his cap, his bag, and his ribbons. Then Sophie grabbed Sebastian's hand and walked back and forth with him on the sidewalk. "Where are we going?" whispered Sebastian. "Nowhere. We are waiting. We are walking in a waiting pattern." "More waiting?" "You can whistle if you like." Sebastian tried to whistle. "This is boring," said Sebastian. "Am I going to die?" "Shh," said Sophie, for Mrs. Wilson had returned with her letter and her cup of coffee. Sophie whispered, "Now we visit Mrs. Wilson and we pretend that we weren't here before." Sophie skipped up the walkway and Sebastian had to run to keep up. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," said Sophie. "You're up early." "Oh, hello there, Sophie," said Mrs. Wilson. "It is a very special morning. I have just received a letter in the mail." Sebastian shouted, "I did it!" Mrs. Wilson looked surprised. "You did what, my dear?" Sophie said, "Just ignore him. Sebastian is happy because he's learning to go to the bathroom all by himself, and this morning he did it, if you know what it is." "Oh," said Mrs. Wilson. "Well done, Sebastian." "Can you read the letter?" said Sophie. "What does it say?" It says, "Hi, Mrs. Wilson. Do you like roses? We do. Love, Bert and Fran." That's what it says. And look, there are rose petals in the envelope and a lot of stickers. I didn't know Bert and Fran like stickers. "They don't," said Sophie. "I mean, they didn't used to like stickers, but now they do." "I see," said Mrs. Wilson. "Well, I will have to send them a letter back. Perhaps you can help me write it." Sophie was happy to help Mrs. Wilson with her letter. When it was finished, Mrs. Wilson licked the envelope and closed it. Sophie got to put on a stamp, which was very special because stamps are the most expensive stickers you can get. "Could you bring it to the mailbox for me?" asked Mrs. Wilson. "We can deliver it directly if you like." "A special delivery? How nice. But we don't have a mailman." "Oh, yes we do," said Sophie. "Sebastian, go get your mailman clothes. Hurry, quick." Sebastian sprinted off the porch and disappeared behind the bushes. A moment later he came out dressed like a mailman. He smiled and waved. "Look," said Mrs. Wilson, "the mailman has arrived." Then Sophie put the letter in the mailman's bag. "Bye-bye, Mrs. Wilson," she said. "I will show the mailman where to go." "Bye-bye. Thanks for visiting." "No problem, and we may come back later." "If you do, perhaps you could ring the doorbell?" "Can we?" "You sure can. Just watch out for the petunias." Then Sophie and the mailman left and headed straight for Bert and Fran's house. Bert and Fran were already outside. Fran was reading the newspaper, and Bert was on the lawn, frowning at the dandelions and doing stretches. "Here comes the mailman," shouted Sophie. Bert looked up, and Sebastian gave him the letter. "We have mail, Fran," said Bert. "It's a letter." "Who is it from?" asked Fran. "Let's see. The address says it's from a long ways away, from a certain Mrs. Wilson, who lives on Memory Lane." "That's wonderful. Why don't you read the letter?" Then Bert put on his reading glasses and he read the words slowly. "Hi, Bert and Fran. I love your roses. They brighten up my day. Thank you also for the stickers. I will treasure them. I would like to visit you more often, but most days I'm feeling sore. It's the arthritis. Sophie tells me that I have arthritis because I like to write. She says, writing is hard and makes your head hurt. I think she is right. But words can also bring joy, and so I will end on a happy note. May your day be filled with lovely thoughts that sneak up and surprise you like little children. Yours truly, Mrs. Wilson." Bert stopped and looked at Fran. Fran was smiling. Then Bert said, "What do you think, Sophie? Do we need to send a letter back?" "Of course you do," said Sophie, and she explained to them how to keep up a good respondence. So from then on, Sophie helped with writing letters, and Sebastian got to deliver the mail. And for all that work, they were paid with candies.